as I always say. With me in the studio today is Patrick Giggs. All I have to say is that often a word of advice before I go any further. Anyway, from a wise man, you can never lose direction. That is a saying it's an old African saying. A word of advice from a wise man, you can never lose direction. So says a quotation from Uganda, by the way. Is a man who is a retired journalist, and whatever you is meant to be done in Africa, he's probably done it already. So his biography is a who is who, and he has the African DNA in his blood, by the way. Though you look at him and you see a different kind of person, but he has his African DNA in him. He was advisor to the Ethiopian Minister of Foreign Affairs from 2004 to 2019. Yeah, that's right. And he previously worked as a senior research analyst on the Horn of Africa in the UK Foreign and Commonwealth Office. Yeah, those are 2002 and 2003. He worked as BBC World Service. He worked at the BBC World Service 1974 to 1993. Reported on Africa. He went on to become a producer on Focus on Africa. Headed the BBC Somali language service for 5 years. In short, this is something about him. He has published a couple of books on Africa. Welcome to the program, Africa Speaks. Yeah. Maybe I need to know, why Africa? Why Satellite? Why Africa? Your interest in Africa?
It was actually a mistake.
A mistake?
To begin with. Yes. When I left university, I had some Pakistani friends who suggested I should go and work in Pakistan.
Okay.
So I asked the British Consul whether there were any jobs in Pakistan. And they said no, but had I thought about Addis Ababa?
Yeah.
And so I had to ask where Addis Ababa was, actually.
Yeah.
And I looked at the map and saw it was halfway to Pakistan.
Okay.
So I thought I'd go to apply for a job in Addis Ababa first, and then perhaps go on to Pakistan. But I was a medieval historian at that time, and when I arrived in Ethiopia and found that it was essentially still a fairly feudal society, I became much more interested in Ethiopia and really never got away from it.
Okay. So once you landed there, that was it. I'm going to stick around here.
It was, as a historian, it was exceptionally interesting because the Emperor Haile Selassie this was the mid-60s.
Yeah.
And he was still in power. But the country was still developing in a way that was still a long way to go, if you like, in many respects. But it was one of the very few parts of Africa which had a long history.
Yeah.
If you take Ethiopian historians looking back to the story of the Queen of Sheba and Solomon as being the foundation of the Ethiopian dynasty, then it goes back 3,000 years. And certainly it was one of the few areas in Africa which did have a very long state structure.
Yeah.
And it was extremely interesting and exciting to be there, but as a historian, and of course as well for the changes that were taking place.
Yeah.
And I was teaching at a secondary school where the students were...
Oh, yeah, that's secondary school in Ethiopia. That's the first job you had in Africa.
That's the first job I had, not just in Africa.
It's the first job you had?
It was my first job.
Okay, all right. Looking at going there, falling in love with the place, remaining there over the years, and the discoveries and the things that you did over a period of years, there has to have been something said, okay, because you've done a lot of traveling, you've been to other parts of Africa.
True.
And where else?
Well, I've travelled quite widely in Africa, mostly or more than elsewhere, in the Horn of Africa. I mean, in Sudan, South Sudan, and Djibouti, Eritrea, Somalia. As I headed the BBC Somali language service for 5 years, I've been to Somalia really quite often.
Yeah.
And Kenya and so on. But I've also been around in Central Africa and Western Africa as well. Guinea-Bissau and Mauritania and Cote d'Ivoire.
But when you look at the continent and you look at the various other African countries, are there similarities? We are looking at changes now. Are there a lot of similarities, or are there so many changes?
Well, there's so many changes.
Yeah.
From when I first went out to Ethiopia, yes. I mean, it's over 50 years.
Yeah.
And of course, there have been an enormous number of changes. But and there are a lot of differences in the sense that Ethiopia has got a very long straight tradition, and that's not apparent in quite a number of other areas.
Yeah.
I mean, most of the states of Africa today are, if you like, they're colonial constructs,
Yeah.
and where there have been other long-term African states, Egypt and Morocco and parts of Mali and so on, these have been overtaken, if you like, by events really since the 1960s when the colonial states became independent.
Yeah.
And the period of colonization, of course, made an enormous and lasting, and not necessarily for the better, impact on Africa, of course.
Of course,
and that has continued. I mean, it's been very difficult for people to get rid of it, partly because the colonial states, of course, have spent a lot of time trying to ensure that you don't really break away from the situation. You try and keep control. The French, in particular, I think, are probably extremely good at doing that for a very long time.
Yeah. They've done that. They've done that, and that is very discouraging in the 21st century. That
True.
It's still going on.
Well, in some respects, even now, it's worse than it was before.
Yeah, then it was. Yeah.
Because what happened in Libya with the overthrow of Colonel Gaddafi, whatever one thinks of Colonel Gaddafi, the way he was overthrown has been a disastrous situation for Libya.
Okay.
Outside intervention at the wrong time and place.
Yeah.
One of the lessons one should learn, I think, from something like that, is that outside intervention should be kept to an absolute minimum.
Yeah. But those in the political, the political circles look at their own interests. They don't really look at.
But that's
the
true.
interest,
That's not just true. That's not just an African problem. It's a universal problem.
Yeah, it is.
In the way Africa is often targeted for having the wrong sort of leaders, or people talk about excessive corruption and things like that.
Yeah.
But if you look at the way in which a lot of the states elsewhere in the world, in Europe as well, operate, then I think there's really not very much difference.
Yeah. But the difference here is that there isn't really too much of me in Europe. There is too much of we, and the difference. That is where the difference is, because in Africa we have too much of me. The leaders think in terms of me, and there is corruption is everywhere. But at the end of the day, that's something that I've been trying to find out. How do we get that out of our DNA?
If it's in the DNA,
I'm
not sure you get it out.
Mm-hmm.
I don't think it is. I mean, there are structures that you can build into government, and the way in which the government operates, the way in which you deal with, if you like, corruption. If you deal with elections, and you have a democratic structure.
Even if it's written down, for example, and you have a constitution which should be followed, somebody comes in there. He changes the constitution. He's in power for the next 20 years.
If you have a structure which allows for the constitution to be changed.
Oh yeah.
I mean, that is the problem, if you like. It's much harder to change, well, in theory, it's much harder to change, say, the British constitution. But according to some versions of recent events, that has become slightly different. I mean, we've introduced in the last few years in the UK, at any rate, the issue of referendums.
Yeah.
That's something new, and if you're going to start doing that, there are other changes that have been made in Europe and America, which have encouraged the appearance of populist governments, or governments with populist support, which have changed the structure of democracy to some degree. Yeah,
but that goes within the 21st century anyway, because changes are meant to happen over the years, because new things come in, new laws come in, whenever there are new things that are coming in, people tend to want to admire those, because our generation and our fathers' generations are two different generations.
Absolutely, but if one of the current things that people are very strong on is the question of gender, the question of youth, particularly in Africa as well. And there's been a lot of talk about the need to have gender parity in government.
Yeah.
Ethiopia's recently introduced a gender parity cabinet.
Yeah.
Kagame in
in Rwanda
did
he has
as well,
done that,
and
yeah.
others are trying to follow suit.
Yeah.
Whether this is a good thing or not is probably irrelevant, as it were. It's become the catchword. It
Yeah.
is a good thing, I
Yeah.
think.
Yeah.
I don't want to suggest it isn't.
Yeah.
But the same is applying to everyone now talks about the need to incorporate youth.
Yeah. Yeah.
Because the largest element of the population in Africa is youth, is under 30 or
Yeah.
whatever it is. Now, that's fine, except that one of the problems with youth, if you like, is that it is inexperienced. And that can cause problems.
Okay. Yeah, inexperience. But the thing is, yes, to a certain extent, as you're saying, yes, it can cause problems. But at the end of the day, the youth are looking at their generation. If we don't fight with our generation, then something's not, because tomorrow they are the ones going to be the Middle Ages.
I don't think
changes
they
are
need to
taken.
fight with our generations. Or your generation. My
Yeah.
generation's older
Yeah.
as well. I mean,
Because there's a tendency we don't see things the way they see them. Because once you've gone through, and you are saying he's not going to be here in 20 years' time, but I'll be here. I
Yes.
might be here, and
no,
I'll
in that sense, I entirely agree with you. But at the same time, there are certain things that are, if you like, easy to do, or certain things that are difficult, or certain things that probably aren't sensible to do. And every generation can make the same mistakes.
Oh yeah,
That's,
of course.
That's
of course.
unnecessary.
Yeah, it's understood. It's understandable.
Yeah.
But you learn from those mistakes.
Well, do you?
Yeah.
I mean,
That's the kind of feeling I
The
have. yeah.
First World War was followed by the Second World
Yeah,
War.
yeah,
You know?
yeah.
I mean, we haven't had a world war recently, but we have a fair amount of conflict. We don't seem to have learnt that fighting is less than necessary.
Yeah. Okay.
This-
Okay.
I mean, the African Union has declared 2020 to be
Yeah.
the
With no
year in
conflicts.
which the stopping of the guns.
It's everybody talks about it as it's a mouthpiece. Really, they don't really come there to do anything. They talk about things they want to do, and then that's it. And then they go away, and they come back for the teas and so on. But nothing really.
Well, I'm not sure that's entirely true. I mean, I think, for example, the African Union Peace and Security Council has been taking a lot more stronger positions over the last few years, and is acting quite firmly in certain areas.
Yeah.
I mean, it's difficult.
But those are individual states. If Ethiopia, for example, Uganda, for example, and I think Rwanda, and when they said, okay, there's an issue in Somalia, and Museveni said, look, if you can't pay for the army, we'll go to Somalia.
Well,
Yeah. You see the point. That is an initiative.
He's now
but-
had what 10 years in Somalia. How far that's worked is
Yeah.
perhaps another issue.
Exactly. Yeah.
Certainly, the AMISOM has failed
Yeah.
to defeat Shabab. It has certainly had an impact. On
Yeah. Oh yeah, it has had an impact, although it's not a big impact, but it has had an impact.
It's fairly big. I mean, Shabab was sort of in control of 2/3 of the country
At
probably
one
at
point.
one
At one point, yeah.
and that has been cut back a very long way. And in theory, at any rate, Somalia is going to be having one person, one vote elections this
Yeah.
year, and a presidential election next year. And this will be the first time that Somalia has been able to do that.
To do that, yeah.
20 odd years.
You did write a book about Ethiopia, or you even wrote a number of articles on Ethiopia, having lived there obviously for much longer than anywhere else in Africa.
Yes, that's
And you wrote the pros and cons of the country. What do you think? How do they take that when they came out?
Well, I spent the first 8 years of my working life in Ethiopia.
Yeah, okay.
And then got thrown out actually under the emperor.
Okay.
Because I got involved in.
Oh, you got thrown out.
I got involved in the student activities of those days.
Yeah, yeah.
Being rather young and impressionable still.
Yeah,
you know.
yeah, yeah.
My students, if you like, radicalized me to some degree.
Okay, okay.
And
Yeah.
I was trying to do a PhD at the time,
All right.
and I turned that into a book called The Dying Lion.
The Dying Lion.
Well, I was. It came out in the year that Haile Selassie was actually overthrown. Anyway.
Yeah, yeah.
Um,
Oh,
but-
that's the year you came out.
Yes,
Yeah.
but unfortunately they had the revolution before I'd finished the book. If they'd had the revolution a year later, I would have looked very good,
Yeah.
very prescient. But no, I mean, Haile Selassie's problems, if you like, were that he had difficulties
Yeah.
in
Yeah.
dealing with the students and the younger generation. I mean, he
Okay.
was 2 generations away from them, and he failed to deal with a famine
Okay.
as well. And
Yeah,
one
yeah,
of
yeah.
the,
He
one
did,
of the
he did,
major
yeah.
famines they had. And he was overthrown, though, by some of the people whom he had essentially replaced as nobility and as senior positions in power over the years. I mean, he had become a highly centralized ruler and got rid of his feudal nobility, or at any rate cut their powers.
One of the key things that somebody wrote about him was the fact that he didn't change as a monarchy with the 19th century and the 21st century, because when you have a monarchy and an absolute monarchy, it's like what's happening in not Botswana, what's that country? Swaziland.
Swaziland.
Yeah. In years to come, nobody will be surprised if there's a coup there, because it's not changing with the modern times.
Well, in fact, Haile
that could have
Selassie,
affected
Haile
Ethiopia.
Selassie did change quite a lot. I mean, he modernized a great deal. But when he was born, there was no railway from Djibouti to Addis Ababa.
Yeah.
There was no car. There were no cars in Addis Ababa. No one had seen an aeroplane, and
Yeah.
so on.
Yeah.
He lived through an enormous amount, including the Italian invasion and the 5 years of Italian occupation,
Okay.
and then returned. And he did a great deal in many respects in terms of improving the educational structure, setting up the basis of a modern government, and so on. He just didn't move, if you like, fast enough. There was an attempted coup in 1960, which nearly overthrew him. He came back. He was abroad at the time. He came back and
it
they
was
got rid of
squashed,
it, squashed it very easily, in actual fact. But if he had died then, he would have been revered as a really great modernizing emperor. But after that, he, if you like, closed down slightly. He didn't carry out the kind of reforms that the people who made the coup wanted him to do. He remained as the semi-divine emperor.
Okay. How about having poor advisors? Could that have been a major factor?
Probably not, because the emperor was not actually very good at taking advice. I don't think in that sense.
Because he dealt with the Italians for quite a long time. He was so close to the Italians, and
well, to begin with, before the Italian invasion, he was never really very fond. Ethiopia's always been nervous about the Italians because of the fact the Italians had the colony of Eritrea and created Eritrea. I mean, after the Second World War, Haile Selassie wanted to bring Eritrea back into Ethiopia. It was kept as a British mandated territory for 10 years, and then was brought back into Ethiopia first as a federation, and then in 1962 Haile Selassie dismantled the federation and incorporated Eritrea back into Ethiopia.
Okay.
And that was actually when the Ethiopian Empire was at its largest extent, because it included Eritrea. And that in turn set off one of the things that was instrumental in the collapse of the imperial regime, the struggle for independence in Eritrea.
Okay.
I mean, it was a 30-year struggle which finally succeeded in 1991 when Mengistu fled.
You get all these years back together. Religion, it plays a big part in that region. You've lived there. You've lived there and worked there, and you've seen the rise of El Shabaab, and of course the Jews as well, the religious groups that are existing in Ethiopia and Eritrea at the moment, and now we've seen the division in Somaliland, the clans.
Well, that,
How do you join? How do these people? How do you expect this governance to be done when these divisions of religion are?
well, the religious issue is the main problem, if you like, in that sense, is that Ethiopia is historically a Christian country.
Yeah.
The Highland Ethiopian area in particular, but Ethiopia itself is 50% Christian, 50% Muslim, roughly
Yeah.
speaking. Same with Eritrea,
Mm.
actually. Somalia, of course, and Somaliland and so on, are totally Islamic.
Yeah.
There's no, there are no, or very minimal numbers of Christians
Yeah.
in those countries. I mean, Ethiopia has been fairly careful to try and minimize the dangers, if you like, of Islamic extremism,
Yeah.
of something like Shabab taking root there. But the Shabab, for example, is an extremist element, like
Organization, yeah.
ISIS
Mm.
and so on. But its main strength has come probably from the fact that Ethiopia intervened in 2006 in Somalia, and that sparked off
that war in Nogadan region.
No, this was
That was
later.
a different-
This is
that's later,
2006.
yeah.
It, partly in order to deal with a problem that was involving extremism in Shabab. But Shabab came into focus because it could appeal to Somali nationalism against Ethiopia, the traditional enemy.
Okay.
I mean, Ethiopia was invited to intervene by the then official government of Somalia
Yeah.
against the Islamic Courts Union in Mogadishu.
Yeah.
That, and if you like, there was a kind of religious element involved, but not in Ethiopian terms. They were looking at it from the point of view of helping the government of Somalia against its opponents.
Okay.
But it allowed the Shabab to appeal to Somali nationalism. And Somalia is a
And the
problem.
clan issue.
Well, Somalia is a problem in a sense in the region because Somalis live in five areas:
Okay.
Djibouti, Ethiopia, Kenya.
Uganda as well now.
Well,
we've got a good number now, yeah?
Those are people who fled.
Yeah.
But former Italian and former British Somaliland.
Yeah.
Somalis, in fact, were divided up in the colonial period
Yeah.
among the 5 countries. And Somalia has a 5-pointed flag, 5-pointed star on its flag.
Really?
And those 5 points represent what were the 5 Somali territories, colonial
And
territories.
you even find them in Yemen, by the way.
Oh yes,
Yeah.
and Somalis are scattered an awful long way.
Yeah,
You'll
yeah.
find hundreds, thousands of them in the UK. In most of the major ports of of England, you will find Somali populations and so on. I mean, the events of the last 20 years, or 25, since 1991 and the fall of Siad Barre after the Civil War,
Yeah.
thousands, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of Somalis have fled the country. And many have gone to Ethiopia, to Somalia, and to Uganda, and so on.
Yeah. Now, the issue of involving the Western powers has been one of the major issues in these regions. And having lived there and having seen the changes that are happening in Africa, there's a big tendency that Britain and America, sometimes they just have to get involved. If their interests are sort of threatened, or if they see that their interests might not be carried out by anyone else. At least this was something in the 60s. But it's still going on underground.
Yes, not so much underground.
Yeah.
It's fairly clear, as it were. I mean, for example, in Ethiopia, and when the emperor was overthrown in 1974, the regime that followed, the military regime,
Yeah.
turned to Russia.
Oh, yeah.
And this, of course, was the time of the Cold War.
Yeah.
And that introduced, when the Ethiopians turned to Russia, the Russians at that point were actually allied fairly closely to Somalia. And Ethiopia had been, under the emperor, allied to America, to the United States.
Yeah.
That alliance switched in 1977 when the Somalis actually invaded Ethiopia, and there was a brief 2-year war.
Yeah.
So the way in which
Yeah, but
the outsiders that have been involved has been fairly overt. You know, it's not covert in that sense. At the moment, the Americans, for example, are helping very strongly in Somalia against Al-Shabaab.
Yeah.
And Ethiopia has been recently become, in the last few years, has become really quite close to China.
Yeah. It is. And the Americans are moving in. They want to protect their interests in the Middle East, so they've got to come around. And Eritrea, now I think there's a big negotiation about an airbase being built in Eritrea, or a military base in Eritrea.
Well,
I don't know how far those things have gone.
There's a base in Eritrea which belongs to the United Arab Emirates.
Yeah.
And that, in a sense, is, if you like, close to the Americans. The Americans haven't got a base in Eritrea at the moment. They used to have a long time ago.
They used to, and there was talk of bringing back one. But then again, when you look at the Gulf region as well, it has started looking at its interest as well.
Oh yes, very much so.
These other various Gulf countries like United Arab Emirates, Oman, they are looking at what they can do, especially in Somalia now.
Yes.
I understand they put quite a lot of money there.
A lot of money, certainly. But in Somalia, you've got two different Arab elements involved, if you like. Because the United Arab Emirates and the Saudis are interested.
Okay.
But there's also the Turks and the Qataris.
Oh, yeah. But the Saudis are fighting United Arab Emirates in some way. The two have a conflict of their own.
No, the Saudis and the United Arab Emirates are more closer connected in the
to Somalia than.
No, I mean they're more closely. I mean they operate together largely. The opposition, if you like, in that sense, is Qatar and Turkey, because this is the big divide in the Gulf area.
Now, I want to turn our attention on your work with the BBC, and I say to focus on Africa. Obviously, you came across quite a lot that was going on the continent, and what I discovered when I visited the BBC a couple of years ago is that the government of the day has sometimes got an influence over certain things that are happening within the region. So the reporting might not be impartial in a way. Is that true?
When you say the government, you mean the British
government? When I say the British government, say for example, Boris Johnson has an aim, has an agenda somewhere.
They have an agenda.
He influences the programs.
The UK government has always had an agenda. That is true. But in fact, the BBC has always, particularly the World Service, has always been extremely resistant to any British government interests. I mean, one of its major problems has been that it used to be funded by the Foreign Office, and that made it slightly harder to deal with. But there has always been, I think, the World Service has always been remarkably successful in dealing with the government interests. I mean, for example, during the Falklands War. Mr. Thatcher used to get very, very angry with the World Service because the Spanish section used to refer to the Malvinas Islands.
Oh, right. Yeah,
not the Falkland Islands.
Falklands, yeah.
She used to get very angry about this. And there's always been a problem, perhaps, or a potential problem.
But you've never come across an issue, say, for example, you've got a story that has got to come out, and that's a very interesting story which the world needs to know about. And somebody somewhere at the top says, look, the Director General or someone says, look, I think we better hold on to that. We better not do ABCD, because
the BBC would listen to what was asked in that sense, but normally speaking, it would not accept.
It won't accept
any constraints on it, or at least not when I used to be there. Whether it does any now, I doubt, to be perfectly honest. I mean, I think things are not. One always thinks things aren't so good as they used to be.
The reason why I say that, when the Biafra War took place in Nigeria, there were certain things which were meant to have been recorded and brought out, and that brought even the boxer. There was a boxer called Dick Tiger, who's a an Igbo man, and he had been knighted by the Queen. He even returned his medal back to the palace because he says, look, the reporting, one of the reasons he gave was that the reporting of the war by the BBC was not what, it wasn't done in a straightforward way. Yeah.
There were criticisms, certainly, and I know on one occasion that there was at least there were strong accusations.
And the Vietnam War as well. The Americans, the Vietnamese were complaining that there were certain stories that were not coming out because the British had bent with the Americans. Yeah.
But if you have a conflict situation, and you're
conflict of
reporting
interest,
from both sides of the conflict, you inevitably get a problem, and it's not always easy.
Yeah.
I mean, the BBC certainly always used to be, and I think always has been, very careful to try and check up on any stories. If normally speaking, won't ever broadcast a single version of events unless it's got some additional backup to unless perhaps it's its own reporter, whom therefore it trusts and is sent abroad and so on. It works very hard at trying to be balanced and impartial and so on. Something that's very difficult to do, of course.
Yeah.
And I think it's much less successful perhaps when it's reporting about the UK.
Oh yeah.
I mean, the World Service did have and still has a very, very strong reputation. It's one of the major assets of a British government.
Yeah.
And I think it's very important. I think it should be continued to be funded.
It's very interesting because the way the principles on which it was founded and the way it has been going on over the years, people supported it and still do.
They still should.
Yeah,
when I was working for Focus on Africa, and this will still be the case today, we were reporting about Africa from Africa.
Yeah.
The reporting went out from London, but all our reports were coming from people in Africa.
In Africa, yeah.
Or Africans we were interviewing in London or elsewhere. I mean, it wasn't our voice on Focus. It was Africa's voice on Focus. And I think I remember being told once that the EPLF fighting in Eritrea used to record Focus on Africa.
Yeah, they were
day.
listening to it. Yeah,
they were listening to what we were broadcasting about them while they were a guerrilla movement.
Exactly. Even Museveni, I think in his book, he wrote once because he was a guerrilla leader when he was fighting the Obote government in Uganda. He also said, look, most of the time we actually would listen to BBC Focus on Africa, and we would get our information sometimes from there. Because then we would know what to do. We would know that the outside world is listening to what we are doing. Yes. But there's an emergency of Al Jazeera at the moment in the media world. Al Jazeera has emerged, and so many other broadcasting corporations are coming up all over the continent. This maybe has slowed down, though the major players who used to, especially Al Jazeera now, people listen to it. People sort of watch it because it has gone where the BBC used to go. Is this where the funding had the problem?
Well, I think it's partly funding, if you like. It's also partly the lack of interest in Europe, America, and Britain.
Could that lack of interest be in the government as well, the government of UK?
Yes, I think probably it is. But it's also very obvious in terms of, I don't think any British newspapers now have an Africa correspondent. Or very few of them.
Very few of them, yeah.
There always used to be a Telegraph Africa correspondent, a Times Africa correspondent, and so on.
Yeah, they're no longer there.
They don't have, and they used to have people on the ground in Africa, usually in Nairobi.
They just take somebody there now when an event happens. But Al Jazeera has got journalists who move from left to right in areas.
Yeah.
They've got the East African correspondents. Several of them move from one country to another. So
it's become a lot hard. There's a lot more competition for the BBC. That's certainly true. But the BBC has just recently increased its language coverage in Africa quite significantly.
But I see a cell somewhere in the future which will be challenged by the ordinary men and women in this country, because Boris Johnson hinted
Yes.
on that at one point, that
Well, this is
they're looking at how much
I
money
think
they're
this would
spending.
be. I think it's a great pity if they do cut the funding any further, and the BBC
Or even
has
sell
to
it. Sell it.
Well, yes, that would be a disaster. I think. Absolutely. And Johnson doesn't like it because he thinks that it's anti-Brexit or anti-conservatives.
No, I think he was saying that it's almost like a white elephant that is taking in a lot of money, and it's not.
Well, you can criticise its output, of course, and a lot of people do. But I'm not sure that anybody would do it any better.
Yeah.
I mean, its major problem, if you like, has been the growth of social media.
Oh yeah.
And it hasn't really, I think, discovered how to deal with Facebook, how to deal with social
Yeah.
media, YouTube, and so on. I mean, no.
It's remained in the 19th century, while everybody has moved
I think
into
it
the
remained
21st.
I think it remained in the 20th century.
Yeah. Oh, 20th century. Yeah. Okay.
Not
yeah.
the 19th.
Not the 20th century. Yeah.
I think
yeah,
it is a bit upset.
Yeah.
It's a problem, and I don't know that anyone can deal with it yet. I mean, but I hope they will be able to.
It will be a shame when we look at generations that have.
I think it will be a disaster,
yeah.
to be perfectly honest. There is room for a state-funded and relatively and largely independent organisation to
Yeah.
deal with this.
Yeah. The issue of ethnic minority comes in as well while we are at the BBC, because most of the articles that have been appearing in the Times and other newspapers really said, okay, by this time around, they should have the ethnic minority. They could even have the chairman of it being from ethnic minority background. They don't seem to be raising the bar as we go along.
That's possibly true. I mean, I think the BBC has remained, to its considerable degree, a liberal, possibly white, literati London-based operation in a sense. I'm not sure that I could really comment on that, because I worked in the World Service, where of course you have an enormous number of people from outside the UK. And we employ. I mean, I worked for the Somali service. I was the only non-Somali there. Of course.
Okay.
And it should have really been run by a Somali anyway, and it now is, of course. But the same with the Hausa service and the Swahili services and so on. I mean, the present Somali service, Swahili services are run out of Nairobi, not from London as they used to be.
The reason I'm saying that is that Trevor McDonald, one of the best broadcasters this country has ever had, he's from the West Indies, and he said, look, okay, at the times when he raised with somebody, when he went to ITV, and he raised to become somebody, and somebody he had left behind at the BBC was in the same position 20 years later.
You can certainly criticise the BBC on this. There's no question of it. I mean, it should. The BBC has been very slow to respond to this, just as it's been rather slow to respond to the gender
issue, which has
as well. But there again, I mean, I'm not sure that the BBC is entirely to blame. I mean, if you're going to have parity of salary, this is fine, but you should be parity on equality of action. And I think possibly it's fair enough to say that experience might also play a role in that. But there, of course, you do come up against the problem that 15 years ago there were very few women involved in broadcasting. They have recruited a lot more now. They're now going to get onto gender parity, but that's going to be a very costly prospect.
It is. But the thing is that they're probably not ready to walk the walk, as they say. But they want to jump the walk so that they are in front of certain people rather than walking.
They should need to. But the BBC,
because when you walk, you get the experience.
That is true. But the BBC is like any major organisation. It's like if you like, a super tanker sailing along. It takes 10 miles to slow down a super tanker, or 50 miles to turn it around. It takes years.
It takes years.
You've got to build it through the structure, and that's something that. And the BBC is a huge organisation.
And I'm looking, what you've just said is what probably Africa needs as well. A super tanker, that is, there are certain cultures, there are certain issues, like for example Somalia. the clans have got certain a way in which they have lived, and
Yes.
it's extremely difficult to change them. Northern Nigeria has had that problem with the Boko Haram, is it? Yeah, Boko Haram, and the cultures that come in, so it becomes difficult. How can we overcome that now? Because it's
Well, it's like any change in culture. It's something that takes a long time. It requires education.
yeah, of course,
and so
yeah, that's one of them.
I mean, in that sense, it also probably needs a very extensive
Investing money,
well,
putting money in it.
investment, but a media structure in which people can be educated and so on. So you need an educational structure, you need a media structure, you need a government structure.
Yeah, you need to do that.
And all of that needs to be resourced.
Yeah.
And that's one of the major problems that arises out of, if you like, the colonial system. You know, the states that came into being were not properly resourced, some of them.
Well, Ghana is doing quite well in this sense. I was talking to a Ghanaian diplomat last year, and one of the things he says, look, okay, we realize the changes, and with those who are coming from diaspora, where there's a lot that is going on, and with the education and with the structures, we are learning, and the presidents that have ruled Ghana are seeing changes that are coming. So maybe Africa can take a leap.
It could,
from that.
taking a leap is quite difficult. I mean, if you're suddenly starting to go for, as it were, the fourth industrial revolution,
Yeah.
and move on to use of artificial intelligence and this kind of thing. You know.
Yeah.
All right, that's a good idea in principle, perhaps, but one of Africa's major problems at the moment, if we're speaking about Africa as a whole, is jobs, is employment.
Okay.
I mean, I don't know about most of the states of Africa, but Ethiopia has got an enormous number of unemployed people. We're talking millions, 15 or 20 million. Now, these people need jobs, and if you're going to actually progress, you're going to have to provide them with jobs. You know? And that is the basis for, I mean, industrialization has to be involved in this, you know. And finding an industrial structure that will employ that many people,
no, it's not there.
Well, it's not possible. I mean, Ethiopia's got to revamp its agriculture. For example, it's got to modernize its agriculture. And Ethiopian agriculture, by and large, is still actually, I've heard it described as being in the Neolithic age.
Something in the 18th century, somewhere.
No.
Not even there. It's got far beyond.
5,000 years. I mean, you're still using ox plows and so on. There is very little tractor agriculture, you know, developed agriculture in that sense. Remarkably little irrigation and these kind of things. Now, all of this requires a great deal of money. It also requires changing the attitudes of the generation of the farmers. Most of the younger generation don't want to stay on the land. They want to go to the cities. You know. This is the same all over Africa. And I think one has to be careful about this. We're talking about Africa if it's a single unit. And although Africa wants to be something like the European Union and so on, it is still 55 or 54, 54 countries, and they are very different.
Culturally, religiously, you know, a lot differ, and those lot that differ create a massive change, like we saw in Southern Sudan and Northern Sudan. The two religions, and you know, it's impossible to even put them at the same table.
They should never have been in that sense united.
The same applies to Nigeria, the northern and the
I mean, breaking up countries though is a tricky one. I mean, it's happened in Sudan. But it happened because South Sudan became independent because the Khartoum government agreed to it. Eritrea became independent because Addis Ababa accepted it. Because of the change of regime there. Somaliland has not been accepted. Because Mogadishu government will not agree.
To that.
But Somaliland would like to remain independent. They've had talks with the Somali government, and they'll have further talks probably. But the chances of an agreement are fairly minimal, because the Somali government goes into talks assuming that there will be a solution and bring Somaliland back. The Somaliland government goes in there on the basis that they expect Somalia to agree to its independence, finally.
Oh, yeah. So they have two different ways in which they...
These are two parallel lines,
which can't...
they will not meet.
Yeah, it's impossible. It's impossible.
I mean, you then throw into that mix, which is a problem in itself, throw into that mix the possibility of United Emirates or others financing...
financing one side,
one side or the other.
There was an African summit here in London almost 2 weeks ago now, so a week or so ago, and of course Boris Johnson was explaining to everybody that the opportunities, those African leaders who came here, that are going to happen now that Britain has left Europe. But Africans are being skeptical about the entire thing. Do you really see Brexit as some kind of a savior from what will happen in Africa in years to come, with Britain taking much responsibility, or even putting more money in Africa?
I think Britain will probably put more money into Africa. Yes, it'll try and increase its trading links and so forth, certainly. But it's going to be fairly difficult to do, I fear, in some respects. I mean, for example, Kenya exports a fairly substantial amount of horticultural products,
to
flowers, to England. But they export them not to England directly. They nearly all go through the Netherlands. And it's from the Netherlands they then get
And that's
exported.
where the funding base came from,
Well,
actually.
There's a lot of the companies are Dutch in origin.
And can I make you laugh? There is in Belgium, I think in March, there's another African summit in Belgium, which is organized by the European Union. So having seen this, so there is going to be a scramble for Africa then by the British
in what sense? And the Americans are also trying to improve this as well. But the Americans, of course, are doing it. I mean, you ought to throw China into the mix as well. And the Americans are certainly doing it in order to try and block China.
The Chinese,
whereas in that sense, I don't think the Europeans, perhaps to block China to some degree. The UK is more interested in itself in that sense. I mean, Britain now needs to have a much bigger trading relationship with most of the rest of the world. And from that point of view, it's very necessary. And I think, yes, they will work very hard to improve trade links with Nigeria, Kenya, and places like Ethiopia, which they haven't really had substantial trade with.
But you think that could also improve maybe the standards of living, or create jobs in Africa, or something like that?
Create jobs, probably, yes. I mean, Ethiopia certainly is working very hard on that sort of basis, setting up industrial parks. But the amount of the numbers of people you can employ in industrial parks, yes, I mean 2 or 3, 4, 5, 600,000. But we're talking millions.
Yeah, of course, millions.
And Ethiopia is particularly vulnerable in a sense because it is so large, like Nigeria. I mean, Ethiopia's got 110 million people.
Really? Oh my goodness! The issue, I think, at the moment, I'm looking at it from the angle that certain sectors in Africa are often forgotten. The way our population have grown, not just in Uganda, Kenya, or Tanzania, or even Ethiopia and other parts of Africa, is the fact that we went into certain areas. Say, for example, improve the Medicare, but then don't put any money into employment. But you have improved the hospitals, you improved everything, because a lot of money comes as donations to go to hospitals. I can name so many hospitals built by privately in Uganda now, and in Kenya as a whole. So the standards of living, people living longer now because the hospitals are there, the medicine is there, but there are no jobs.
Well, that's not just a problem, again, for Kenya or Uganda. I mean, you'll find that in every country where you improve medical care, people live longer.
Of course,
there's talk in the UK or other parts of Europe of what's going to happen in a few years' time over pensions. Because my generation, not yours, but my generation, at any rate, is going to be needed to be funded for its oldest age. But I'm living longer than my father. I've lived longer than my father did. and my children will live longer than I do.
Mm.
You know, the whole thing is expanding.
Yeah.
And the question of balance, if you like, or priorities,
Yeah.
and prioritizing the structure of development and government in terms of that sort of progression of the length of time people live and jobs and so on,
Yeah.
is critical. It's
Yeah.
going to be critical.
Yeah, it is. It is. It is. It is.
But at the same time, you know, you need to prioritize education for the jobs, if you like.
Yeah.
You need to prioritize development for the jobs, health for for people to live.
Yeah, of course, of course, of course.
What order do you put these in?
Yeah, it's really up to you as a leader.
Right.
And then, of course, if there are wars that have taken place in areas, it
Yes.
becomes extremely difficult because people will always move,
Yeah.
you know.
And even when you have an effective government, or fairly effective government, as Ethiopia's had actually over the last 25 years, that structure is now has been breaking down.
Yeah.
And Ethiopia has an ethnic federal structure.
Okay.
Ethnicity has suddenly has risen.
Yeah,
So
yeah.
you've got ethnic conflict taking place, and the dangers of ethnic conflict, if they flare up too greatly, are,
Yeah.
of course, very large.
The next thing you know,
People get worried about the prospects of something of what happened in
In
Rwanda
Rwanda,
happening again.
yeah.
I mean, I don't think that's necessarily, well, in fact, I don't think that's likely in anywhere else. I mean, I think the world will notice,
Yeah,
as it
quickly.
were,
No.
well, one would hope.
No,
they will.
with the social media, I think it's
That increases the dangers as well, because it's so easy to activate people.
Yeah.
And I think one of the most necessary priorities today should actually be how to control social media.
Oh, right.
I don't mean necessarily stop it or anything else, but some way one's got to find a way of ensuring that it doesn't take off in the wrong.
Yeah, in the wrong direction.
In the
yeah.
wrong
Now,
direction.
you've been around. You've traveled across Africa. I should say Kenya, Uganda, Tanzania, practically almost all the 54 countries that are on the African continent. What is the worst and what is the best you've seen of the continent?
Oh, the worst, I think, is probably very easy, famine.
Farming.
I mean, the people, when you've seen the people who...
That happened in Ethiopia. You were
in
there
Ethiopia,
at the time, yeah.
No, 1973, 4, and again in the 1980s. And subsequently, there's been a lot of times when there's been a lot of people who need food aid and so on. The same problem has arisen in other parts of around, in Somalia and so on. And that's certainly the worst, yes.
Yeah, that's
But
the worst.
some of the conflicts, I've never been a war reporter on that,
okay, yeah.
in the real sense of the word, but I have attended some of the conflicts, the Ethio-Somali War of 1977-78, and I've been up in Eritrea during the Eritrean War of Independence,
Yeah.
travelling on the Ethiopian side, not on the not with the Eritrean side. Those are the worst sort of
Yeah,
things.
yeah.
I
Okay,
think.
okay.
The best in that sense is well, at one level it's the people.
Yeah.
I
The lovely
mean,
people, yeah.
People, I mean, they're probably elsewhere as well, but I haven't really travelled elsewhere. So,
Okay.
but people in Africa, in generalised sense, are always very friendly, very helpful.
Very
and so
welcoming.
on. I mean, one always used to, when I was driving around in Ethiopia, for example, so I used to take some of my students around back in the 60s, and it was very clear, if you stopped by the side of the road, you know, you only had to wait about 5 minutes, and whoever else was passing would stop and say, "Have you got a problem?"
Yeah, yeah,
You
yeah.
know, it was an immediate sort of, "Can we help?"
Yeah, yeah. Can we help you?
Yeah,
Yeah.
I mean, I find Africa an extraordinarily beautiful place as well,
Yeah,
in that
yeah.
sense. I mean, Ethiopia's got some of the widest stretches of climatic conditions, from the Danakil Desert, which
Yeah,
is one of the hottest places on earth,
Yeah.
up to the Simeon Mountains and so on. And there are areas in Ethiopia that I would love to go back to again. And elsewhere in Africa, I remember flying into Maseru in Lesotho
Oh, Lesotho, yeah, yeah.
when the jacaranda trees were out. and the city looked blue. It looked like a sea,
Yeah,
actually,
yeah,
because
yeah.
all the jacaranda trees were flowering. That sort of thing.
Okay. We're coming towards the end of the program, and we're looking at the political structure and changes that are taking place in Africa. Any prediction of what could probably happen in the next 20 years? We might not be here, but at least we are seeing the younger ones coming up, and the changes that could probably shape the political landscape that might help the continent, because we're looking at China, we're looking at conflicts that never existed a long time ago are coming back to shape, because Africa's biggest problem has always been it is shaped by the outsiders rather than the insiders.
Well, it's going to continue to be shaped by outsiders to some degree, in the sense that the Chinese and American influence will remain.
Will increase, yeah.
It certainly try to increase, possibly in conflict and in opposition to each other.
Oh, yeah, right, all right.
But the amount of money, the amount of resources available, I think, will increase significantly. And that
In Africa?
Yes, I think so. And that will be important in terms of developing the priorities that are necessary for jobs, for education, and all the rest of it. I mean, one of the things that's clearly going to happen more, I think, is regional integration, the growth of the regional economic communities under the AU. And the AU, of course, has recently introduced the Africa Continental Free Trade Area, which is going to should make a good deal of difference. A lot of it will depend upon how people operate it.
Okay.
And that, of course, is the catch, if you like. One of the things that one can look around at Africa today and see some people who've been there in power rather a long time.
Yeah, I know. That's
perhaps it's time to change.
It's one of the biggest diseases we have. Yeah.
Yes. I mean, somewhere down the line, Africa needs very urgently to find a way of preventing people from staying in power as long
for too long. Yeah.
And this requires a democratic structure. And that, I think, is perhaps the most important necessity.
But how to achieve that? That's the biggest problem.
Well, that is something that I would say only Africans can do. It's not something that should be pushed by the
outside world.
By the outside world. And it isn't necessarily the right answer to enforce parliamentary democracy of the kind that you have in the UK or elsewhere in Europe. And there are different ways of implementing democracy. I think Africa should decide on that for itself.
It should come from the cultural backgrounds.
Yes, very definitely.
Yeah, get the chiefs who used to rule and the kings years ago and bring them together. And then some Ghanaian pastor
there are elders. There are kings in Ghana, in Nigeria. There are elders in Somalia and so on, and elsewhere there are chiefs of various elements, and this is something that the diaspora can help in to an enormous degree.
Even women. Bring more women at the table.
I'm sorry, women should be involved. I mean, in that sense, gender parity is something that should be. Well, and also coming back to the youth as well.
Yeah. Get the youth involved as well.
I mean, but the trouble with it, actually, if you're pushing the idea of sort of elders and the traditional leadership, this is something that won't approve of the youth.
Okay.
I mean, the two don't go terribly well together.
Yeah, this is where we come in with dialogues and dialogues and
dialogue is very important.
Yeah.
The new Prime Minister in Ethiopia, Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed, has just published a book in Amharic, but it's going to be translated in English shortly, Medema. And this means synergy, dialogue, coming together, big tent politics.
That's why they gave him the Nobel.
That's not why they gave him the Nobel Peace Prize, but it's something that builds on that, perhaps.
Yeah.
And that's a promising approach.
Okay. Well, I do hope our leaders are listening to these messages. It's been wonderful having you on the show and getting all the knowledge that you've acquired over the years in Africa. And I do hope that you probably go back again. And
I'll go back again. Yes,
and
certainly.
There or something. Yeah. You know?
Yes, I will do so. Thank you.
Thank you for coming to the program.
It's a pleasure. Thank you.
There isn't really not anything that I can add on from what the wise gentleman has just told us. And I do hope that we'll be together again for the next edition of Africa Speaks. Thank you for watching, and may God bless you.